right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. We have a very interesting event today with Rebecca Carter-Chand speaking about her book, um, Christian Internationalism and German Belonging, The Salvation Army from Imperial Germany to Nazism. The book was the first winner of the Mosse Book Prize. And so Rebecca will talk about the book, and then Brandon Bloch will give comments, and then we'll open it for discussions and questions. I have the privilege to introduce the two speakers. I'll say before that, my name is Ofer Ashkenazi. I am the Mosse visiting professor at UW-Madison this year. The speaker we have today, Rebecca Carter-Chand, is the director of the program's Religion and the Holocaust, which fosters scholarship, teaching, and reflection on the intersection between religion and the Holocaust. Rebecca's research focuses on Christian minorities group in Nazi Germany, including the Salvation Army, Quakers, Seventh-day Adventists, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Brandon Bloch, who will give the comments, is an assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a historian of modern Germany and Europe whose research focuses on themes of democracy, religion, human rights, memory politics, and social thought. His first book came out recently with Harvard University Press. Is Reinventing Protestant Germany, Religious Nationalist, and the context of post-Nazi democracy. We'll start with Rebecca.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this invitation to speak. It's been a joy to work with the University of Wisconsin Press and the Mosse program on this book program, the book project and publication. And many thanks to Sky and to Brandon and to everyone at the press as well. So this is a real treat to be able to present on the book for you all today. And I'd actually like to start with an opening anecdote that I use at the very beginning of the book, which is the end of the story, as a way to frame sort of what's at stake in telling this story about the Salvation Army. And then we will go back to the beginning of the story, I promise. So this is just one paragraph that I would like to read. In March 1947, a former senior British intelligence officer, who also happened to be a Salvation Army officer, wrote a letter marked strictly private to the Chief of Staff at the Salvation Army's international headquarters in London. Adjutant Lee had been in Germany working on denazification, and in the course of investigating Nazi Party leadership, he noticed that the Heilsarmee, which is the German branch of the Salvation Army, was listed as an auxiliary organization of the National Socialist People's Welfare, or NSV. He immediately recognized that this affiliation with the second largest Nazi organization after the German Labor Front meant that the Nazi Party considered the Heilsarmee to be politically reliable. It also meant that the Heilsarmee leaders had cooperated with the Nazi regime in ways that were not familiar to their British colleagues. The Chief of Staff forwarded the letter to the general, the overall leader of the Salvation Army, writing, quote, "If this is really true, and it is possibly, and in part at least, then one can understand the Russian suspicion, at least of the present leadership," end quote. An even more pressing question, but one that went unarticulated in the memo, was why this critical information was not already known to the leadership of the international organization nearly 2 years after the end of the war. The Salvation Army had been brought into the NSV in late 1933 and was listed in the Nazi Party handbook beginning with its first edition in 1936. So this book is really an attempt to understand how a small international religious organization found belonging in Nazi Germany, an outcome that seems counterintuitive upon first glance. The Nazis were, as we know, generally suspicious of international organizations, and the Salvation Army made internationalism central to its identity. It was a small religious community, the kind the Gestapo spent a lot of time trying to sort out and assess political reliability, with none of the connections or stature of the main Protestant and Catholic churches. Especially curious was this military symbolism that was woven throughout the Salvation Army in the form of military style uniforms, ranks, flags, and marches, all of which competed with Nazi aesthetics and rituals of inclusion. And I argue that the Salvation Army leveraged both its national and international identities to bolster and repair its reputation and legal status in varied political contexts. Sometimes, such as in wartime, it was more helpful to emphasize its national identity and belonging. In the context of German defeat at the end of both world wars, when the international organization was providing much needed humanitarian assistance in Germany, it was suddenly helpful for the German branch to lean into that institutional brand of the international organization. And so what I found was that the Heils Army's experiences in the Wilhelmine period, World War I, and the Weimar years really shaped how it operated, how it marketed itself, and how other Germans viewed the organization. And that only with this long chronological lens does the Nazi era start to make sense. So I do want to, at this point, back up and explain how I got to this topic and give a brief primer about the Salvation Army itself, as I understand not everyone is familiar with the organization. So I was really inspired by a wave of scholarship in the 1990s and 2000s that teased out the complicity of the main Protestant and Catholic churches between 1933 and 1945. Thanks to these books on your screen and more, we know that the churches and the people in them largely welcomed the rise of Nazism and to varying degrees accommodated, legitimized, undergirded, and participated in the Nazi project. When they came into conflict with the regime, it was usually over issues around church autonomy. This led me to wonder about the smaller Christian churches, labeled as free churches or sects in Germany at the time, many of which had come to Germany more recently, around the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and still had ties with their denominations in the Anglo-American world. Surely their German identity would be different, I thought. They didn't have close ties to the state, but rather were on the margins of the German religious landscape, and their identities were very much wrapped up in that minority status. What I've found is that most of these groups, driven by fear of suppression and anxieties over their legal status in Germany, really aggressively shaped their public profile to demonstrate their loyalty and align with Nazi demands. And for the most part, it worked. Most of the groups on this screen were not shut down by the Nazis. The Jehovah's Witnesses are a notable exception, and I'm happy to talk more about that and why that exception took place in the Q&A if anyone is interested. So most people know the Salvation Army from images like this, raising money at Christmas time, or like this, the thrift stores, which are all over North America. Or maybe you've seen Guys and Dolls, or even Mr. Bean's Christmas special. I mean, with these images collectively, I think you are well on your way to understanding the Salvation Army. But let me provide a little bit of their historical journey. William Booth was an itinerant preacher with a Methodist splinter group in mid-19th century England. He and his wife, Catherine Booth, also a preacher and author, left the Methodists to found a mission to the urban poor in 1865. They first sought to evangelize the population of London's East End slums, but the movement actually found more success with the working classes of provincial English towns, a pattern that would repeat in other countries, including Germany. By 1880, Salvationists were wearing uniforms and employing military ranks, reflecting the Victorian era popularity of so-called muscular Christianity. The Salvation Army embraced internationalism and was drawn to pacifism, especially among that first generation of Salvationists. Yet, as it spread abroad and really became embedded in the British colonial project, it organized itself along national lines, taking cues from the Red Cross and Protestant missionary endeavors of the day. So it did not, although it debated pacifism, it did not embrace a pacifist policy, but rather allowed for personal conscience among individual Salvationists. The early Salvation Army was a spectacle by design. From the beginning, it sought attention through noisy, dramatic antics in public spaces. I chose this particular image of the Salvation Army in London in 1883 because it was created by a German artist before the movement even came to Germany. So we can see that its reputation preceded it. The movement gained some measure of respectability in Britain. It was really in the early years, I'd say, creative and gutsy in its advocacy around industrial labor conditions in particular. But as the organization adopted a hierarchical and even autocratic leadership structure, William Booth came under intense public criticism. Often, this criticism of financial mismanagement and wielding an outsized amount of political power was tinged with anti Semitic tropes. Here we see a couple from the British press in the late 19th century. There was a long-standing rumor that William Booth was, in fact, Jewish or part Jewish, although this is not supported by any evidence, including family baptismal records. Now, there's a lot more to say about Victorian England's anti-Semitism, and I have more examples of how William Booth was depicted in the press in this way, and the ways that anti-Semitism was used to criticize his style of leadership. But the reason that I think it's important to mention here at the beginning is that these rumors of William Booth's supposed Jewishness find their way to Germany later on, where it piques the interests of Nazis, including Julius Streicher, and then the Salvation Army there has to or chooses to engage in a sort of defensive public relations campaign to distance itself from these Jewish supposed Jewish connections. Another thing to note about the early Salvation Army is that it embraced women as preachers and set up a model that, while it still reflected the patriarchal culture of the day, it did give space for women to do preaching and have leadership roles. This painting is by Otto Heikert, who is part of the Dusseldorf School of Art that sought to authentically portray working class life in Germany at the turn of the century. The image conveys the intimacy and intense emotions that were encouraged by the Salvation Army as part of conversion experiences. And so the female Salvationists became a common image, which was a mixture of naivete, courage, and virtue. You can think of Guys and Dolls, also Major Barbara, and many other stories that incorporate the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army quickly spread to continental Europe, North America, and British colonies, arriving in Germany in 1886. Rather than calling people to come to church, the Salvation Army's method was to go into the streets to spread their message, raise money, and recruit new members. Germans came to recognize the Salvation Army as a noisy and persistent presence. A professor of church history, Theodor Kolde, observed that he wrote a whole book about the Salvation Army, observed that the spectacle of military culture seemed to be a gimmick, but the entire method was actually very calculated because it conveyed legitimacy, order, and discipline, and certainly raised the public profile of the organization. The movement found more acceptance when it shifted its focus to social work in the 90s. So it was only just for the first few years that that the Germans that they were um, very unappreciated in Germany and experienced a lot of pushback. Um, the shift to social work in the 1890s really helped to improve its profile. It ran homeless shelters, provided free meals, offered assistance for people with addiction, operated maternity homes for unwed mothers, etc. Um, Sorry, my slides just got a little bit mixed up. Before I go any further, I do want to just show the table of contents. Um, sorry, my notes. I need to open up again. My table of contents, I'll just continue without my notes, um, is follows largely a chronological frame. And yet I often will span the traditional markers that are in common in German history around the wars and the political transitions because I really wanted to emphasize um, how first the Salvation Army was often most active in these moments of transition, of political transition or from war to post-war, and also their the need to reinvent themselves really comes in these moments of transition. Um, okay. So the Salvation Army quickly spread to Germany, as I said, in 1886, and then they experienced this moment of transition in 1890. In these images, you see, or in the bottom one especially, I'll draw your attention to this one from Dresden, 1906, where you see a group of Salvationists with a stretcher collecting an intoxicated man on the street and taking him to an overnight shelter. And you can see the sort of the uniforms and the way that they are standing really conveys a sort of moral, if not legal, authority. And I'll also note that the Salvationists were among the most vocal advocates in the temperance movement and saw a direct linking between social and physical well-being and spiritual salvation. In fact, William Booth's many aphorisms included warnings that one, you can't preach to a man with an empty stomach, but also that washing a man's shirt does not make him clean. In other words, healing the body and the soul went hand in hand. And already at the turn of the 20th century, this framework of habitual sins being linked to poverty and disease was really out of step with progressive social welfare theoreticians who saw the roots of poverty more in the systemic explanations of environment and circumstances. But while German social reformers disagreed about the causes of poverty, they concluded that the Salvation Army was sincere in its efforts and admirable in its willingness to work among the poorest of the poor. Even the biggest critics were always admirable of the so-called good intentions of the Salvation Army. In the first years of the 20th century, and I'm sort of going through this chronology without necessarily signaling the chapter transition sort of on purpose to try to tell this seamless chronological story. So in the first years of the 20th century, the Heilsarmee, again, the German branch, was becoming more culturally and demographically German. And its leadership really made an effort to present the Salvation Army as a respectable, patriotic and useful German organization. By 1914, the Heilsarmee operated 33 social institutions and a training college. An estimated 1 million people here attended its meetings, the equivalent of church services, and its newspaper, Der Kriegsruf, had a circulation of over 2 million. The International Salvation Army was at work in 58 countries and embraced a lofty internationalism that was really fashionable at the time. At the outbreak of World War I, the Heilsarmee cut off communication with the London headquarters. It fought against public criticism that it was a so-called English import and really stressed its members' patriotism and contribution to the war effort wherever they could. And on the right, you see a photo of the Salvation Army providing a free meal to celebrate the Kaiser's birthday. So that you see more and more of this aligning their activities with patriotic events, national holidays, and um, birthdays of leaders, political leaders. In the course of World War I, this is getting 1917-ish, they start considering actually breaking away from the international organization altogether. And I found documentation to this effect, but it did not happen, perhaps because the war ended before they could actually get it done. However, when the war did end in November 1918, relations between the Heilsarmee and the international headquarters resumed and were interpreted by everyone as having successfully somehow passed a sort of test of internationalism, that their bonds were so strong that they could withstand even these 4 years of war. In the Weimar years, this is where it gets really interesting, the Salvation Army's social work became closely associated with German urban environments. And the public nature of the Salvation Army's activities became so embedded in Germany's urban landscapes that despite its modest size, the organization became an unlikely muse for many Weimar era writers, artists, and intellectuals who were wrestling through major ethical and existential questions of the day. The Salvation Army was used to personify virtue, naivete, and explore the boundaries between good and evil. And so, with varying degrees of accuracy, I would say the Salvation Army is depicted by dozens of Weimar era's most esteemed writers, artists, filmmakers. I put just a few here on the slide. In the upper left corner is a puppet play by Walter Mehring. The poster you can probably recognize, designed by George Grosch, called Einfach Klassisch. And you see these typical stock characters in Weimar society, and the Salvation Army lady is the second from the left. We also have a short story by Elisabeth Hauptmann, who was a collaborator, assistant to Bertolt Brecht. Also, at least 3 plays by Bertolt Brecht feature a Salvation Army character as a protagonist. Here we have the most well-known one, Saint Joanna of the Stockyards, but there's also Happy End and then a play fragment called The Bread Shop that also features the Salvation Army. And it does seem that Brecht and Hauptmann were very taken by the concept of the Salvation Army, even though they had deep criticisms of it and thought that ultimately their approach to solving poverty was not effective. They were still very sort of enamored by the Salvation Army and went around Berlin to observe them on many occasions. On the bottom left, there is a drawing by Katie Kollwitz called Under the Bridge. And this was in her framing inspired by the work of the Salvation Army, although it does not, it depicts the people with whom they worked rather than the Salvation Army themselves. The one in the bottom middle is an illustration from Simplicissimus by the artist Jean Mammon. And the last one is a still from Morn to Midnight, which was a play by Georg Kaiser and then an expressionist film in 1920, in which a Salvation Army character also plays a central role and is really quite devastating. So this foray into artistic representation was a fun and unexpected part of my research. Some of these artistic pieces are sincere and well-researched, like Brecht and Kollwitz. Other examples are bizarre and fanciful. Just to share a fun story, when doing dissertation research at the University of Toronto many years ago, I found myself in an unlikely position for someone writing a dissertation on the Salvation Army of having to order a book from the restricted section of the university library due to its content of erotic art depicting Weimar cabaret and nightlife. Um, I also remember finding a case of a play that was censored in Berlin in the Weimar years, censored for vulgarity. This play had Salvation Army girls, cowboys, prostitutes. It was set in ancient Egypt. It was all very bizarre. So you find all sorts of pieces that are drawing on this trope, usually of the Salvation Army girl, as they would call them, or woman, as a way to reflect on Weimar Germany's skepticism about human goodness and its ability to overcome evil. And I also want to mention here the humor that was often invoked based on the Salvation Army's military persona. A joke in Simplicissimus in 1919 was about the Versailles Treaty, and it goes like this. A Salvation Army soldier, previously known by his Christian songs, now in civilian clothes, appears in a pub selling modern operetta texts. One guest asks the other, "Is this not the Salvation Army?" Whereupon the other guest replies, "No, he's dismissed because the German Salvation Army, at the behest of anxious Frenchmen, must disarm up to a third of its ranks." Okay, making a joke about the impact of the Versailles Treaty. Another um, piece of, I guess, satire in the same vein comes from 1932 in Simplicissimus, where you have this drawing in the midst of all the political polarization of that year and the federal elections. And the caption at the bottom says, so we see the line of Salvation Army officers there with their marching band instruments and all of the different political factions in uniforms on the ground in a heap. And the caption reads, "If this goes on much longer, all that will be left of us is the Salvation Army." So I have other examples in the similar vein, but it's making this play on the Salvation Army military persona and also their place in German society at that time. Moving on to chapter 4, which really looks at how the Salvation Army negotiated its role in German society as a social service provider, and where we see continuity and rupture from the late Weimar years into the Nazi period. I've listed here the activities being run by the Salvation Army in 1928, and they greatly expanded in these years, bought a bunch of properties, and then in the midst of financial difficulties, I'd say fairly mismanagement, and changing policy about private and public welfare in Germany, the Hausarmee got pretty good at public relations and self-advocacy lessons that they then applied to the new Nazi government. This negotiation of sort of what counts as as accepting donations versus selling a newspaper, where they sort of argued it both ways at different times. Are you selling your newspaper? Is it making a profit or not? All these things. How are you using money that you are getting from donations? There were always these accusations that that the organization was sending money back to England, sending money out of the country that people thought they were donating to help local situations and projects. This negotiation and their public relations lessons that the Salvation Army learned leads them into the 1930s. And so then I examine how the Salvation Army adjusted to National Socialism. And really interestingly, mirroring the main Protestant churches' so-called church struggle, the Hausarmee also had an internal struggle of its own on a much smaller scale. Here's a letter from a Salvation Army officer writing to Reich Bishop Ludwig Müller in September 1933, expressing his desire for the Heilsarmee to break away from the international organization and come under the patronage of the German Christian movement, the part of the German church, the German Protestant church, that sought to align the church with Nazism. This movement within the Salvation Army was crushed pretty quickly. Some people were fired, some people were shuffled around. Um, we learned that most of the leadership of the Hausarmee did not want to break away from the international organization. They still thought they could have it both ways. As for the Nazi government, we know that there was a lot of investigation into small groups like this, especially in the first couple of years. And there was really, the government was, I'd say, undecided about the Salvation Army until 1934, when the general, at that time, Evangeline Booth from England, wrote a carefully worded telegram to Hitler. So I'll just read this. And you can see how carefully worded it actually is. Please allow me to express my deepest appreciation and sincere gratitude for your conciliatory attitude towards the Salvation Army in Germany. The only reason for our existence lies in the alleviation of grief and sorrow and in the healing of suffering. I wish that the members of the Salvation Army in Germany, both individually and as a whole, can participate in the efforts to create a better Germany. So it seems that we know this telegram did reach Hitler's office, and it seems that it had its desired effect because just a few weeks later, Hitler's office issued a memo to all Gestapo stations across Germany, in which he wrote, Führer and the Reichskanzler has recently expressed that he does not oppose the work of the Heilsarmee, who have never been politically active, and also for reasons of foreign policy, does not want any action taken against them. So we know that Hitler was prioritizing foreign opinion at this time. And so, from his perspective, there was no need to alienate a group of willing participants in the Nazi project and whose organization had built strong social capital in the Weimar period. And so the Hausarmee continued to operate throughout the Nazi period. As I mentioned at the beginning, it was made an auxiliary organization in the NSV, along with a dozen or so other specialized social welfare organizations. The only other religious one was the Adventist Social Welfare Organization. Like a lot of Germans, Hausarmee officers became increasingly disgruntled with the NSV as they were obliged to spend more and more time and effort on NSV activities rather than their own, even though many of these activities appeared to align, such as the winter relief, helping people get through the winter, and the summer mother and child vacations in the countryside for well-being, etc. Um, Despite this, sort of growing sense of disgruntlement and the organization is important to note was never shut down in even throughout the war years, and they continued doing many of the same activities. So one thing that the Salvation Army always said afterwards is that we just uh, we just help whoever's in front of us, and we were able to continue our activities like we had always done, feeding children, etc. Running our institutions for the vulnerable in society. So throughout the 1930s, until the war broke out again in 39, the Hausarmee was in contact with the International Salvation Army. And here we see a band from England visiting in the summer of 1936. When World War II started in September 1939, the two organizations, or one organization, two branches of the same organization, did as they had done in World War I and broke off all communication for the duration of the war. The following year, when German occupying forces took over Western Europe, particularly France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, where the Salvation Army was also at work, they had less toleration for the Salvation Army operating in those countries and forced those national branches to close. Still, other Salvation Army branches found themselves in neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden, and so they had obviously very different experiences of the war years in their contexts. So the presence of this same organization in so many different political contexts during the war invites comparison of how religious communities responded to Nazism, to refugees, to anti-Semitism, etc. And so another unexpected finding of my research was just how many Holocaust survivors who gave testimony mention receiving assistance from the Salvation Army in many different European countries, both the occupied countries that I mentioned and neutral countries. In Germany, by contrast, I found only one or two examples of Salvationists helping Jews. And despite being, so what I argue is, despite being part of the same religious tradition, shaped by the same institutional culture, bound by the same structures, Salvationists in Germany responded very differently than their co-religionists in other countries. And so this really challenges a common assumption that we find in scholarship that hypothesizes, I guess, that religious minorities, by virtue of being minorities, are more likely to help groups facing persecution. And I think that there's compelling evidence in especially in German occupied Western Europe that this can hold up, this hypothesis. However, it absolutely does not hold up when we're looking at the religious minorities in Nazi Germany itself. And I think that there were sort of all forces pulling them toward supporting the regime and accommodating the regime. And in other countries, um, they were either operating sort of much as usual in if their countries were not part of the war, or in occupied countries, the Salvation Army was often part of the national resistance movement, and so got swept up into helping Jews and others facing hardship during the war. And so this is sort of an aspect of my research that I was pleased to be able to sort of pull back the lens and look at the European context as a way to understand the German context a little bit better. Now we get to the end of the war, and this is back where we started again. And to reiterate, the Salvation Army never had to do any acknowledging or reckoning with its actions in the Nazi past. It, much like many other Germans and German churches, were able to craft a story of persecution and hardship during the war. But the Salvation Army was able to do this even more effectively, I think, by then embracing its international affiliations once again. It and sort of skirted around the issue of any kind of participation or support for Nazism as such. I think I'll stop here. Well, just as a slight coda, I will say that one reason why the Salvation Army until now has not really received any scholarly attention has to do with the archives being largely destroyed, and then no one really prioritizing keeping institutional records later. And so this is also part of the story of why for so long they've you know, avoided any kind of post-war reckoning with their history. So I'll stop there and let Brandon have a few words. There we go.
Great. Thanks so much for your talk. I'll just let it, we're actually moving offices to a new building, which is the reason for this kind of awkward empty shelf scene behind me. So thanks so much to Sky Doney of the Mosse program for organizing this event and inviting me to comment, and to Rebecca Carter-Chan for a fantastic talk. I'll try to be brief so we can have time for everyone's questions. So I come to Dr. Carter-Chan's work through my own research, which has to do more with the large state-sponsored German Protestant church that was briefly mentioned as a political actor in post-1945 West Germany. As we've seen, though, Christian internationalism and German belonging is part of a smaller but growing and really vibrant branch of German religious history that shifts the focus away from the larger Protestant and Catholic confessions and toward the smaller so-called free church denominations. And one of the important claims of the book, I think, is that it challenges the long-standing contention that these denominations had stood in uniform resistance against the Nazi regime, and thereby it joins other critical works on the Baptist Mennonites, Quakers, among other groups. So this is the first book in any language to do this work for the Salvation Army, which makes it especially important. But I think the book is also really interesting and important in the way that it makes a bolder intervention beyond simply recounting the various ways in which the Salvation Army participated in the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft. And in this, I think Carter-Chan builds on, but also moves productively beyond a generation of critical scholarship on religion in Nazi Germany that she talked about at the beginning. Instead, Christian internationalism and German belonging uses this, I think, rather peculiar and by most of us little understood organization to shed light on a host of wider issues in modern German and European societies during the first half of the 20th century. The salience of religious organizations in a supposedly secular period, the meanings of accommodation in dictatorial regimes, the nature of anti-Semitism, and the struggles of international organizations to survive in a world of rising nationalist polarization. And I know Dr. Carter-Chan only had time to touch on some of these themes, but I really recommend the book because I think it sheds a wider light on these sort of large themes of modern European history. It also shows how studying religion can lend a light on these wider contexts. Excuse me. I'll also note, I mean, for me, a real highlight was the third chapter that I could tell from the talk that Rebecca really enjoyed researching and writing, which is about avant-garde artist views on the Salvation Army. I think this is so innovative because it takes a kind of outside-in view on a religious organization. So it flips the traditional methodology of religious history, even kind of critical historiography, that still generally centers the perspectives of members of that religious organization, which I think is, of course, an entirely logical way of going about things. But it was really interesting to see from sort of the outside how the Salvation Army was being represented in the works of Weimar icons from Brecht to Alfred Döblin to Käthe Kollwitz, who use the organization is mentioned as a metaphor for the fragility of goodness and humanitarianism in a capitalist society. And even more, I think the book suggests this kind of connection, perhaps, of those kind of avant-garde movements then to its position under Nazi Germany. So it was the highly public nature of the Salvation Army, as well as this very sympathetic, if naive, public image that it cultivated in the Weimar Republic that made the organization useful for Nazi co-optation, and that allowed, it seems to me, the Nazi leaders to have also a somewhat kind of sympathetic view of its possibilities. So I'll conclude with two questions, and then happy to leave the floor open for everyone else's questions. And both sort of touch on the core theme of accommodation in Nazi Germany, and then the kind of subsequent cover up. And I'm just wondering, and maybe this comes out of my own perspective, but if you could speak a little more sort of in comparison between the Heilsarmee's relative lack of reckoning with the Nazi past and the kind of better studied process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung confronting the past in the German Protestant and Catholic churches. So I'm convinced by your argument that a key factor was the Heilsarmee's ability to return to the international focus. But what I also found interesting about the book is that in some ways it's a more complex story. So the book doesn't kind of center on the sort of smoking gun type of evidence that one sees in work on, the German Christians, Wehrmacht military chaplains witnessing Holocaust atrocities, and so forth. If one goes back, I mean, it struck me that slide from the book, the slide at the beginning with the books from the 80s and 90s all had sort of swastikas on the cover, right? And it was this kind of, sort of muckraking in the best sense kind of methodology that I think, really drove a lot of the controversies of that period. And, what you're pointing to seems to me more kind of sins of omission. There was a lack of support for Jewish emigration, but you also note that wasn't really like supporting immigrants, wasn't really within the Heilsarmee's capacity anyway. That's not really what they did. Simply providing German Jews with, a hot meal and shelter, right? This wasn't going to really help them. So is that also sort of part of the story then of sort of how they're able to kind of deny their complicity because there's this more sort of nuanced dynamic? And the final thing is just if you could speak a bit about the reception of the book. You mentioned at the very end throughout your research, there's a sort of a growing interest among current members of the Salvation Army to kind of deal with this history. But I'm curious, sort of in the 6 months since the book has been published, what's the reception been like among participants in the organization, whether in Germany or otherwise? But thanks for the talk, and I really recommend the book to everyone. It's also beautifully written. And just a great read, but sort of uses the Salvation Army to shed light, I think, on these larger topics. So I would highly recommend it to everyone on the call and watching on YouTube and so forth.
Thanks so much, Brandon. That's really, really kind of you to give such close attention to all the arguments in the book. And I will try to briefly answer what I think is three questions. First, about the Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or the coming to terms with the past, and why it really didn't happen in the Salvation Army when most other, certainly Christian groups, including a lot of the smaller free churches, have done this like since the 1980s and 90s. The German Baptists have issued statements, the Adventists have issued apologies, and why is the Salvation Army one of the few who haven't? And not just apologies or statements of regret, but even just basic understanding of their own institutional history. I think I think it has largely to do with the lack of archives, which made it more difficult to do serious research, and to easier to just perpetuate the common post-war myths that were so popular. I make a small, I do reflect on this and make some small guesses in the conclusion of the book. And I say this not to be judgmental of the Salvation Army in particular, but I think there is something about these nonprofit organizations that really rely on public trust, that make it hard for them to acknowledge past wrongs. That's not to excuse it. Those of us who study German history know that pretty much every sector of German society by this time, every profession, every business, everyone has acknowledged their Nazi past. And so certainly it makes it look worse if you don't acknowledge your Nazi past at this point. And yet, I think for a Salvation Army, for an organization that relies on donations and public trust, it's really hard for them. And there are other cases, the Salvation Army was embedded in British colonial contexts, and there are all sorts of stories that are being told there. Also, they had um, they were part of the apartheid movement in South Africa, and just all sorts of things that are difficult to face. And I think they're slow to do that, you know, for that reason. Um, you're picking up on sort of what you might call the Salvation Army's, it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of their approach to Nazism. And it's true that they never had that much to say about anti-Semitism or Jews. They certainly weren't drawn to Nazism because they were anti-Semitic. That was not something that was a draw for them. On the other hand, they did not go out of their way to acknowledge any kind of suffering. When they repeated, "Oh, we just continued to help people, whoever was in front of us, continued to do our work." I think that is acknowledging a sort of willful ignorance of the pretty significant transformations that were happening in German society in the 1930s. And it wasn't only about the Jews. It was also, I read some comments about how, they were sort of bemoaning how there were fewer people coming to their overnight homeless shelters by the mid 1930s. They were like, "Oh, in the Weimar period, where we were filled every night," and this was a source of revenue for them as well. So they, in fact, kind of took a hit financially by the fact that, but never really asked the question, why aren't there as many homeless people seeking our services anymore? Clearly, it's because the Nazis were rounding them up. They never sort of took that next step to ask the question, but rather just proceeded with their usual activities. I hope that sort of answers a little bit. With the reception history, so I've been in contact with this very small group of Salvation Army historians and scholars. It's not a huge community compared to some other groups. Like I'd say the Mennonites love looking into their own history and doing history. Salvation Army is not as like that as much. But there are some very good scholars, and they have been very wonderful to me over the years. I've been invited by all sorts of different Salvation Army audiences. In fact, I was invited to a training college in New York in January, where they asked me to do a whole day workshop on my book, Salvation Army History. I think clearly everyone, certainly in this generation, is very interested in learning about their own history, sort of warts and all, as you might say. And so I would say the reception has been wonderful. Also, internationally, I've had many Salvationists reach out to me from Britain and New Zealand, etc. It's all very exciting. I think just because there is not all that much serious scholarship being done. But thanks again, Brandon.
Thank you very much, Brendan and Rebecca. We have some time for questions from the audience. Please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A section. In the meantime, Rebecca, if I may, I was wondering, how does it compare? You started to say about, other kinds of historical cases where the Salvation Army had some shady past, but how does it? I mean, is it supposedly a national group that also has some other national groups and they are together, or was it supposedly in the beginning or originally supposed to be some kind of a transnational organization that just something went wrong? I mean, what
Yeah.
was supposed to be there to happen?
Yeah, so from the beginning and up to the present day, it is one hierarchical overall international organization. It has its headquarters in London, and supposedly every national branch, the national territory, reports to the headquarters in London. Now, today, it doesn't. I think national branches have more autonomy than they used to, but still, certainly this was intended to be, and in many ways was a transnational or supranational organization. Especially in the period that I'm discussing in the book, they had a common practice of having leaders, the top position in any country come from an English speaking country. It was very English. So mostly from Britain, but also on occasion from Australia or Canada. And they would be sort of moved around, or officers would be moved around from different countries. So the sort of rank and file would be certainly people of that country. And that's why the German branch really took on a German persona, because the people in the Salvation Army truly were German. But it was always a matter of contention, and that the top position, the leadership position, would probably be an English person, which they did very intentionally.
I think we have a question. Yes, so from Carol Zizauskas, I hope I say it right. Is there a documentation that shows whether any Salvation Army members in Germany joined the Nazi Party? If so, do we know in what percentage?
Yeah, I don't know exact percentages, unfortunately. There was, so in the autumn of 1945, just a few months after the war ended, the Salvation Army headquarters in London sent over an officer to spend a few months reconnecting with the German branch, and he wrote up a long report at the end, which is a very helpful document to see sort of the mood of both what was going on in Germany at the time and also how this English officer perceived it all. And he noted that well, he chose to write the report in such a way that he sort of said, yeah, there were, some Salvation people, in Salvationists and people in Salvation Army families who became Nazis. That was like, what does that mean? Became Nazi? Like, we don't know if they became party members, if they were in some other way. Um, so certainly it happened. I just don't have numbers. And I think, given the whole tone of that report, I'm sure he was under-reporting rather than over-reporting. Um, I know of one example that's sort of an extreme case of a son of a prominent Salvation Army leader in Germany. He was sort of head of the publications department, and one of his sons, I think, as an adult, left the Salvation Army community. He became a doctor, in fact, an OBGYN, and was employed at Ravensbrück and was included in the post-war trials of the Ravensbrück trial, for his, for his activities at Ravensbrück. So, you can go and look at his SS records, which are out at the National Archives. Very interesting. When asked what his religious affiliation was, he said Protestant. He did not disclose anywhere on that form that his family, 3 generations back, had been part of the Salvation Army. So, I have some examples like that, but I just don't have percentages, unfortunately.
You see if
I,
we go.
I'm happy to ask another
Yes,
question. Are
please,
you still
please.
waiting in the chat?
We have
I
10.
wasn't. Could you say a bit more, Rebecca, about the gender dynamics of the house I made during Nazism, which is something that comes up in the book and maybe a little less in the talk. But one of the things that really struck me, right? I mean, the fact that women were allowed to be um, preachers and sort of have these high public ranks makes, I think, the Salvation Army stand out, certainly among the mainstream Protestant and Catholic churches, but also among a lot of the Freikirchen of the time. Well, of course, at the same time, they have a conservative gender ideology. So I'm curious if, women preachers had to kind of shift their roles at all to comply more with Nazi gender ideology. Do you see this kind of dynamic that some scholars have described as sort of racially Aryan women who were sort of pro-regime, kind of having sort of opportunities to rise? Kind of to what extent did the organization have to kind of adjust its gender roles and gender ideology to mesh better with Nazism?
Yeah, thank you. Um, So the gender thing, of having women in leadership and having women as preachers was mostly aspirational, I would say, and mostly came from the fact that the founders, William and Catherine Booth, that Catherine Booth was just such a dynamic and successful preacher and author herself. And of this duo, of this married couple, she was definitely the more educated and articulate and intellectual of the pair. William Booth was more of the charismatic guy. And so I think it was because of her skills that William Booth came around to this idea that women ought to be in preaching and leadership roles. And then you see sort of the children of the Booths, so the Booth family. You see Evangeline Booth rising to the rank of general of the entire international organization. But for most Salvationists, that's not happening. You and only recently, I don't know when this changed, sometime in the end of the 20th century, roughly. It used to be that married officers in the Salvation Army, that the woman would just automatically get the same rank as her husband, and they would always be posted to a place together and kind of officially like share the position. But really, women were more operating in traditional realms of social work, working with children, rather than preaching. So this whole issue of like women like being out and in the limelight in Nazi Germany was not really an issue. But you do see a shift, which is really curious. And one thing that the Salvation Army did a lot, they didn't really announce their changes or adjustments that they were making under Nazism. They just sort of um, quietly made these shifts, which would show up in their publications and their activities. And so suddenly around, I think it's 1932, 33, you see the suddenly every day around Mother's Day, they had this big Mother's Day issue, and they were sort of highlighting local Salvationist families who had lots of children. Okay, this is never something that they had emphasized before. It's clearly just following trends in German society of elevating motherhood before. So the whole gender thing is kind of complicated, but you can see, yeah, you can definitely see them following the trends of early Nazi society.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions, I think this is a good time to end our session. Thank you very much, Rebecca Carter-Chand, for the wonderful book and the wonderful talk and discussion. Thank you, Brandon, for the discussion and the comments. And thanks again, Sky, for organizing this event. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.